Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Rousseau's basic conception of the nature of science and the way in which that fits with religious beliefs or fails to fit with religious beliefs. And the main thing he said that we discussed last time is that from a scientific perspective, the universe is the root metaphor for the universe is that it is a machine. It is a machine with a retired engineer. God created the machine and then let it be. And that's part of the historical development of the conception of science. Contemporary conception of science no longer appeals to God. At some point, he says something like, to be a scientist is to be, if you will, for the purpose of science, an atheist. And he likes to put it that way because he's an atheist, right? If you are an atheist, you might be very happy with the way you're putting it, right? You might think, oh, see, told you science and religion or theism are just incompatible. To be a scientist, to be an atheist, like, well, how more clear than that can it get, right? But it's crucial that, I mean, that's part of Rousseau's rhetoric, right? That's part of, like, he's trying to make it very appealing to be an atheist. But it's not as straightforward as that. I mean, that's too simple. That's a naive move. Um, there's some important distinction that illustrate why that's a very naive move, the move to claim that because science does not appeal to God, science and God are incompatible. That's false. They're not incompatible. They're perfectly compatible. And this distinction between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism illustrates this. So first, methodological naturalism. It's a method for doing science. And it says something like the following: only natural explanations are permitted in science proper. So a important difference between the way that contemporary scientists do science and, say, the way in which someone like Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period did science is that Aquinas has a much broader conception of the nature of science. Science is just inquiry into truth. Anything that is an inquiry into truth is a kind of scientific enterprise. And by that standard, there's nothing at all wrong with appealing to God and trying to explain reality. In fact, that's exactly what Aquinas does, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's a perfectly good way of using the word science. That's not what scientists do nowadays, however. They have built in this principle that excludes the kinds of things that Aquinas was doing. And it's crucial to see that that's not because there's any kind of scientific discovery that showed that Aquinas was wrong. That's not what's happening. It's not that science advanced by showing that Aquinas was wrong. That's not at all what happened. What happened was that people started to be a lot more specialized. It takes a super brilliant genius like Aquinas to be able to do it all, right? To do physics, to do biology, to do theology, political exegesis, to be able to do all of those things. It takes a super genius person. And part of the advancement in contemporary society is the specialization that people have, right? And now you can just be a theologian or just a scientist, a particular kind of scientist, a particular kind of philosopher, right? You specialize in a particular field. And what that means is that there are all sorts of questions you don't ask. You narrow your focus on a particular subset of questions so you become better at that. And that way, even not super genius people can be very good scientists, can be very good philosophers, can be very good, other things. And that is the thought behind methodological naturalism. It's not that science disprove God, but rather that science progressed to be more narrow, more specific. It failed to ask the theological questions for the sake of leaving that to the theologians, just for the sake of specializing in something. Like a linguist investigates the nature of language. They don't ask questions about biology, but that doesn't mean that linguistics has shown biology to be false. Of course, that's a very naive claim. It just means that a principle of operating within the linguistic enterprise is that one does not ask questions about biology, or at least one does not ask those questions as a biologist, right? Maybe the linguist asks some things about biology to the extent that they help him understand facts about linguistics or language. But that's what happened here. The methodological naturalism is not a claim that God doesn't exist. It's a claim about how to be a particular kind of scientist, or how to be a scientist. It's a claim that divine interventions are not permitted in explanations that are scientific explanations. And here's the question: why do that? Why engage? Why endorse this methodological principle? Well, here's what Rousseau says. Science justifies this methodological principle pragmatically by its success. So as I said a couple minutes ago, it takes a super genius person to cover a lot of stuff. And this principle just narrows the scope to a more manageable set of activities. And because it narrows the scope, it enables those that work within the narrow scope to be more successful because it concentrates the resources in a particular way. And that's the justification for endorsing this methodological principle, not because there are no truths outside of this principle, but rather because it enhances the ability of scientists to do their job well by ignoring a lot of stuff, right? That's basically what's happening here. So methodological naturalism is the way contemporary science operates, and no theist should be bothered by this at all. I mean, Peterson, as we'll see shortly, is not. And crucially, atheism does not follow from methodological naturalism. Here's a different claim though, metaphysical naturalism. And now this is not just a method about how to do science, but rather this is a claim about reality. Only nature exists. There is no God. Now, of course, metaphysical naturalism is in fact incompatible with being a theist, with being Christian. One cannot be a metaphysical naturalist and a theist, right? Because one is the negation of the other. Bruce is a metaphysical naturalist as well as a methodological naturalist. All scientists are methodological naturalists, but it takes endorsing metaphysical naturalism to be an atheist. And crucially, metaphysical naturalism does not follow from, it's not supported by science. That's a different claim that goes beyond science. And Bruce acknowledges that. He's smart enough to see that, yeah, that's a fallacious move. That's a quick move. Going from methodological naturalism to metaphysical naturalism, that does not follow. So indeed, I would say that because modern science is based on the machine metaphor, it cannot completely negate religion. It's just not the kind of thing that it's trying to do. Note that I am not giving up on metaphysical naturalism. Roos is a metaphysical naturalist. He is an atheist. He thinks God doesn't exist, but he realizes that just does not follow from science as operating within methodological naturalism. I am saying that I don't think that science on its own does the job. In other words, if you know all of the scientific facts as contemporary science is operating, it does not follow from any of those facts that God does not exist. It is perfectly compatible with all the scientific facts that God exists. Why? Precisely because scientists do not ask those questions, right? They're not trying to answer those questions one way or the other. So the discoveries are compatible with one or the other answer to the question whether God exists. Now, of course, Roos is an atheist. I am starting with a presupposition that normally it is science that tells us about reality and exceptions must be justified. Perhaps that is the difference between us, Peterson himself, because Peterson starts with no presupposition that religion needs special justification before the bar of science. So here's something very important. Here's something that goes beyond the mere distinction between methodological and metaphysical naturalism. Here's a very important philosophical claim that Roos puts forth, and that is that science has this kind of priority over other enterprises, in that other enterprises like theology must ultimately appeal to the bar of science as a way of justifying their views. So this is not quite claiming that metaphysical naturalism follows from methodological naturalism. It does not, right? Roos sees that. But he has a more nuanced kind of assumption built into his conception of science, that anything that is not science, narrowly defined, must ultimately find justification within science narrowly defined. So anything else that is not science must ultimately kind of be grounded upon science if it is to be credible. And as he points out here, Peterson's going to disagree with this. Peterson's going to think like, we have no reason for thinking this. If you look at methodological naturalism, it's just a principle for narrowing the scope. And there is no reason to think that by narrowing the scope of questions, one thereby forces the other answers to other questions that we're not looking at to conform to the answers to the questions we're looking at when we narrow the scope in this way. That's Peterson's response, not Roos's. So the chapter, or at least the section on Roos on the nature of science, begins with some important observations made by Roos. Here's what Roos claims. The dominant metaphor in science is the metaphor of a machine. The universe is a machine, and that settles which questions are appropriate to ask and which kinds of answers count as legitimate answers to scientific questions. And importantly, says Roos, this rules out all sorts of questions as being scientific questions. So they're legitimate questions, they're just not science because of the way in which the scope is being narrowed for the sake of scientific inquiry. And here's some of the questions that are legitimate but cannot be asked or answered by science. Roos continues, quote, if the world is a machine, what questions are simply not being asked? Now, let me offer the following 4 areas not touched by the machine metaphor, recognizing that they were not set in stone. So crucially, these questions that he's going to put forth or identify as going beyond the limits of the metaphor of science. Science does not answer those precisely because scientists are not asking those questions. And they're not asking those questions precisely because the root metaphor of the universe as a machine does not allow for that those questions to be asked. If science were to progress and change radically enough that the metaphor would change, at least in principle, science could ask those questions and try to answer them. But the current resources of scientific thinking, because it is grounded in the root metaphor, they're not enough for the adequate asking of those questions, and importantly, the adequate answering of those questions within scientific methodology. That is the point the Roos is making here. And here are the questions that cannot be asked or answered by science as we understand it now. 1, quote, the fundamental question, why is there something rather than nothing? It is, however, a question that is not answered by science because it is a question not asked by science. It cannot be asked, as science is to ask about the inner functioning or inner workings of the machine, not why there's something rather than nothing that composes the machine. That's a different kind of question that cannot be answered by making experiments at the inner workings of the machine. 2, science doesn't tell us about the foundations of morality. At least science might tell you about how moral sense evolved. So if you use like evolutionary biology might give us some clues as to why it is that we develop things like moral sensibilities, moral beliefs, moral sentiments. But those are facts about us, right? The moral sentiments that we have, the moral beliefs that we have, they're not facts about morality. That is the adequacy of those moral beliefs or sentiments. That's a different question. That we evolved in a particular way to feel compassion towards others for the sake of group cohesion and passing on the genes and so on. That's a cool story. But it's not a story about morality as such. It's a story about us as moral agents capable of moral sentiments. And that story of, the evolutionary biology story is perfectly compatible with there being no moral facts that we're deluded about. Their sentiments are not tracking reality, or it's compatible with there, being a moral reality there that we may or may not be tracking. In other words, the scientific story is compatible with moral facts or with no moral facts. It's just not trying to answer the question whether or not morality is real or not. That's not a scientific question. Why? Because it's not allowed by the root metaphor of science, of reality as a machine. 3rd is the question of sentience or mind or mental states. Science cannot answer, and here we see clearly, when Roos started defining science, he tried to include sentience or mind. But now he says explicitly, actually, in principle maybe, but at least the way that science is currently operating, there's no way of answering the question of what mind is. I personally don't think, continues Roos, that you can solve the mind-body problem. Given an account of how the brain works can be tremendously insightful and within the bounds of scientific inquiry, but I see no bridge between the material brain and the thinking mind. That's not the kind of question you'll be answering if you answer the question of how the brain works. You're still not asking the question about the nature of the mind, how the mind operates, and how mind might interact with things like brains. The 4th and final question that Roos puts forth as beyond the limits of the metaphor of science and therefore scientific inquiry is the question about the ultimate meaning or purpose of the world. The machine metaphor extends only to things moving around eternally as governed by unbroken laws. The watch is not there to tell time, just to keep going around and around and around. There is no ultimate purpose in modern science. So he's blending two things here that might be a bit confusing. One is the legitimate observation that it is beyond the proper bounds of science to investigate the nature of meaning and purpose. That's philosophical inquiry, more generally defined. But he's also going to blend in his own conclusions of there being no meaning and purpose. A more careful way of putting the point that he's after here is to say that science cannot answer these questions. If you go with scientific evidence and theories alone, you do not have an answer to whether or not there is a purpose. He also thinks there is no purpose and there is no meaning and there is no, things just go on meaningless. But that's to provide a philosophical answer to the unanswered question on the basis of science. And he's doing both here. It's crucial to see that he's doing both. So here's a basic picture of reality as seen by Roos that comes out of his conception of science. There are four basic questions that I claim science does not answer because it does not ask, and by its very nature could not ask, nature as we contemporarily understand it anyway. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the justification for morality? What is sentience or mind? What is the meaning of it all? They seem to me to be genuine questions. They're legitimate questions. And that means that they could have answers. I don't have them, claims Roos. So Roos is a skeptic. He does not know the answers to things outside of science. What science delivers is anti-realism, not really knowledge about the way the world is, but rather this human construct that is the most successful human construct in investigating how things work. But things outside of that construct are even beyond knowledge. So the thing that science delivers, claims Roos, is just a human construct, so not really knowledge about the real world, the external world, mind-independent world. And things outside of science do even worse when it comes to enabling us to know reality. So Roos thinks we know actually very little about the world. He's a skeptic about things outside of science, an anti-realist about science, and an atheist. There is no God. My position, claims Roos, is certainly incomplete. A lot of questions go by unanswered. I say simply that I have no answer, claims Roos. I am an agnostic or a skeptic in some sense. He is a metaphysical naturalist. He thinks God does not exist, but he does not think that purely on the basis of science. He realized that does not follow. He's going to provide philosophical and theological arguments for thinking that God does not exist, and those happen later. That's the basic picture of Roos, skeptic, anti-realist, and an atheist. That's the basic conception of reality as he sees it. Next time we'll discuss Peterson. See ya.